Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. As any of you that have been following me know, I think that the housing crisis that we've got in the Greater Toronto Area, Mississauga, right now is really issue number one: housing affordability. And I think that planning, zoning, city councils, etc., are part of the issue in that regard. And so I thought it would be really helpful to check in with an expert on this, and that is Alex Beheshti. Is that correct, Beheshti, sir?
Yep.
Beheshti.
Yep, you got it.
Alex Beheshti is a senior consultant at Altus Group Economic Consulting, where he provides services related to urban planning and land economics. He's also one of the lead authors of the 2020 and 2022 municipal benchmarking studies, which looked at development application timelines in the GTA and Canada. Alex, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. So let me start off by telling you that, I saw a report done by Stats Canada that said that Canada was one of the worst countries in the Western world in regards to approval timelines, and that in Canada, Toronto, Mississauga, Vancouver, and Victoria were some of the worst in Canada, and Canada was the worst. And that it took, and this may not have been a factual statistical number, but qualitatively they said it takes 2 to 3 times as long to get something approved as it does to get something built. Is that true?
Often, yes. So if you look at a large condo project, let's say 400 units, the planning horizon on that can be anywhere between 5 to 10 years, whereas actual construction is, somewhere in the ballpark of 2 to 3 years. Assuming you don't have a massive pandemic and, everything kind of goes flying out the wall.
If it takes 2 to 3 years to build something, I apologize, Alex, but why would it take 5 to 10 years to review it and potentially approve it?
So there are various levels of planning approvals that you have to go through. So, first you have to identify lands for where you want to place that kind of a building. So what we would call intensification lands. Municipalities do this at a high level in what we call their official plan, which is their kind of like planning Bible. It lays out where, when, and how planning is to be done in a municipality. Every municipality has one. And so you identify where you want to, like, let's say, seek a condo tower. Then the applicant has to come in and provide the specifics from the official plan level to the zoning level. And then they have to do, potentially plans of subdivision, plans of condominium, maybe even a site plan. And so there's all these various approvals that you have to go through. And each level of approval, you're dealing with various aspects. So when you're dealing at the zoning level, you may be dealing with the heights, the width, the amount of density on the property, whereas at the site plan level, you're dealing with things like where is the driveway, where are the windows, and things, I don't know, they sometimes fall through the cracks and they just take years and years and years.
I had breakfast this morning with a city councilor that will remain nameless, but obviously one involved in the process. He said on an 8-story building, so a reasonably simple building, he and the developer were shocked that there were 130 pages of comments that came back.
Yeah.
Is that something to be shocked about, or is that just standard course?
Uh, so like you have to look at, like, what is the job of a city planner, right? The city planner's job is not to enable housing. Like, people might be surprised by that. Their job is to comment on housing and to resolve issues that a development may have. And I really got to emphasize with the word may have. And so there's this kind of risk aversion within the public service that, their job is not to say like a development is okay or let's proceed or let's move on. Their job is to find every single potential possible issue with a development and to solve for that problem. And so, there becomes this necessity within planning departments to create comments for the sake of creating comments. And then, there's also this level of,
Hold
I
it,
think,
hold it. What did you say?
there is this drive within the public service to create comments for the sake of creating comments.
There's this drive to create comments for the sake of creating comments.
Yeah, sometimes, yeah.
So let's take a step back. I read Jane Jacobs' book, The Life and Death of Great American Cities, back, when was it, in the 1960s. And she talked about how zoning actually was initially meant for the separation of residential lands versus industrial lands, and that she said that it wasn't in her mind that all that helpful. At least that's what I read. And she said that the organic growth of neighborhoods was actually the best vehicle to get real beautiful, wonderful growth and neighborhood development. So why do we have all this zoning regulation?
So, if you look at the reason we have zoning is the purpose of it is to actualize the intent of the official plan. It's so if the official plan says we want to build residential here, the zoning tells you how you can build that residential. Other purposes of it would be, the separation of incompatible uses, but the word incompatible is kind of a subjective meaning. What means incompatible to one person, it may not mean to another person, and there's often these conflicts within the zoning. The purpose of zoning, well, I'll tell you what we're not supposed to do with zoning. We're not supposed to zone for people. But when you actually look at the zoning, often that's exactly what we're doing. Like we understand as planners, so I am an urban planner. We understand that when you make choices about zoning, you end up dictating who lives in a place and how they live. So I'll give you an example. If I say that you need a 7 meter setback, so setback is from the property line where the structure has to be. So it has to be 7 meters back from wherever the property line starts. That means you're going to have a huge front yard, and that's a huge amount of land that if you want to live in that neighborhood, you have to be able to afford to buy. And therefore, I can dictate who lives in that neighborhood by setting the conditions of how much land and how much floor space or capital a person has to buy. And so, in planning, we're not supposed to plan for people. As planners, they'll say, no, 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 we never plan for people. But in reality, by the choices we make, we end up making these decisions of who can live where and how.
So let me ask you a question about that one specific issue. I used to work for the Walt Disney Company. I did a major master planned development study for Walt Disney World, and we were going to build a residential development, and it ended up being called Celebration. And they did a bunch of surveys, and they found out that the neighborhoods that people liked the most were ones that had porches close to the street, close enough to the sidewalk so that you could actually have a conversation between the porch and the person on the sidewalk. And that they were also the safest because there were lots of eyes on the street and people would use their porches. And also, they wanted to get rid of garages at the front because the garages, big, huge boxes on the front, ended up moving the house farther back and separating out that porch and that house from the street and the neighborliness of it all. With 7 meter setback, which is what, over 21 feet, you're not going to have everything that Celebration said actually made great neighborhoods.
Yeah, so you have to look at what is that Churchillian saying? Like our buildings shape our values and we shape our buildings. And so when we make decisions about how our buildings look and how they act and how they interface with the street level, we are saying certain value statements. So if you live in a place or you see a place where homes are moved really far back away from the street. That's kind of like a king of my castle. My home is my palace. My social life and all the things that I do are contained within my home, and I don't go to the outside. And typically what you see in places that exhibit this is a lack of what we call third spaces. So a third space is neither your home nor your work. It's a third space. And these are places where people have social interactions with their neighbors. And, a third space can still be technically part of your home. It can still be a porch, but it could be the local coffee shop that's just down the street. It could be, all these different, it could be the park. But, the places where we see a lot of social isolation, it's like a lot of this stuff is designed by zoning. Like these are not accidents. It is not an accident that with the housing crisis, we also see a massive spike in loneliness as people are in neighborhoods that are depopulating and they're not designed for social interaction. And so the social interaction they have, which is with family members, they lose because the kids move out and then you're just kind of sitting in this home and you're going, there's no, maybe I have neighbors that are friends, maybe they moved out and then there's no one I know in this area and I feel isolated. And so these things are not accidents.
So
And so,
why is Canada the slowest in the Western world, and why is Toronto, Mississauga some of the slowest, even in the slowest Canada?
So, when we did our study, you can kind of trace it to the type of product you're building. I always like telling people that the fastest application you can do is the one you never have to submit. So the first problem is we always want to make sure we have absolute control over every aspect of development. And so we have this issue of allowing the market to decide. And so one example with that is with parking. Municipalities are moving to the phase of where they're trying to get rid of parking, but a lot of like slowdowns in applications can be a discussion between the developer and a city where a developer is saying, for example, I can't sell that amount of parking. There isn't actually demand for that amount of parking. Can I please build less? And the city kind of makes you go through that process. The other side of it is, Mississauga, a lot of that new housing that it's being built is in large condominiums, and large condominiums are complex projects. They are the modern, pyramids of Giza of our time. Like yes, we can construct these massive buildings within, relatively short period of time compared to the pyramids, but these are very complex buildings, right? And there's a lot of things you have to solve for. And when most of the housing that you build in Toronto and Mississauga are tall, condominium buildings, by their very nature, they're going to require a lot of planning to be involved
A
versus
lot of
something like
planning, yes, but why could it possibly take 3 times as long, 5 to 7 years,
it's just that
as it
control
does to
factor.
actually build the sucker?
Yeah, it's that control factor, and a lot of questions, I think of is what value are we getting out of this planning? I don't think a lot of people look at the condos that are being built and go, I'm particularly pleased by what the end result of this. A lot of issues crop up with height, and it's amazing how much time we will spend between back and forth between us on the project team and the city planners debating 5 stories. Like it is incredible. We will spend sometimes years because city planners want a building 5 stories smaller, and the reasons they give are not very good. Um, and it's like, well, why couldn't we take that time to work on how a building interfaces with the street? Because most people, when they walk by a condominium or they drive by a condominium, that's their actual experience of a condominium. I mean, some people don't like seeing tall buildings, and that's an aesthetic decision. But how buildings interface with the street, I think, is important. But I think like we waste so much time on the things that really don't matter, and the results that we get from that time being spent is I don't think the marginal benefit. Like if you think a condo is too tall, I don't think you care that it's 5 stories shorter. I don't think that makes your life feel better or anything. And then it behooves the question of like, why do we spend a year or two just debating that? Like, did anybody get any benefit from this really?
I think it's a really good issue. I've spoken to several different architects, and they tell me that above 6 to 10 stories, you don't actually notice height. It is, as you say, it's how you engage at the street level that people notice. So why is it that politicians, that ratepayer groups, that neighborhood groups, that planning people spend so much time focusing on whether it's 40 stories or 45 stories or 50 stories? Why is it?
Because you have to say that I got something, right? So when a development comes in, and so now that we get these games, like so if you're an honest developer and you come in and you're like, I need 40 stories, I'm gonna put in for 40 stories, um, then the problem is like instantly you're gonna come in, the neighborhood group's gonna be like, I want 10 less. The counselor and the planners will be like, we'll bargain with you and ask you for 5 less. And you're gonna go, I need 40 to make this building work. Like and then so now you get developers who will come in and say, I want, 55, and you're going to ask me for 10 less, and I'll give it to you. And so you have all of these games being played. And the reason is people want to show quote unquote results, right? They want to show, I got something. I fought. I fought the developer and I got something that is easy to understand. It's hard to say to regular people. I had conversations with a developer, and we broke up the massing of the building, and we made sure that there are the commercial at the ground level is not one long wall. We broke it up so that there's lots of stores, so it's nice to walk by. It makes you feel like you're in a nice walkable environment. Like it's hard to explain to people those wins versus I got 5 stories knocked off that building. Like that's an easy win, and I'm using these quotation marks to explain to people that you got something, right?
You
And
know, in,
and
in every other segment of our society, we would let, not every part of it, but we would generally let the market decide. I've been involved in the beer business. I've been involved in the pharmaceutical business. I've been in the entertainment business. I've been in, several other businesses. There's more rules and regulations in the real estate development business than and then almost any other business I've been involved in, other than frankly the pharmaceutical business. And there they don't try to influence, how many this is and that. They just say yes or no based on a test, and which is completely reasonable. I don't understand why. And I'll give you another example. In Mississauga, in the Square One area, they had no restriction on height. They didn't build 150 stories or 100 stories. They built what the market demanded. And frankly, because of that, we got some architects that were building beautiful buildings because they could actually build what they thought would sell the best in the market. And if you walk into City Hall, you know what they have bragging on the video screens? Pictures of those tall buildings. That's what they like to see in Tower. They brag about is this is the image of our city. So why is it that planners and the city councils that they report to think they know better what people want than the people themselves and the developers that are hopefully selling to those people? Why is it?
So I would say, like, there are rules in planning, and then there is the negotiative process of planning, right? So um, there is this kind of tension between a rules-based process and then let's make a deal planning. And I don't think we have the balance between them. Like, for example, we have provincial legislation that says you have to densify and intensify certain areas of your city. And a lot of municipalities, they just drag their feet on it. They spend years avoiding it, or they put in policies they know that won't actually actualize it. Why? Because they want a negotiative process, right? Look, the broken planning system is a reflection of our broken municipal democracy. When only so many people participate at the municipal level, they have a lot of power to ask for very specific things, right? When a lot of people participate, it becomes very hard to ask for specific things because politicians have to work to the broad benefit of everyone, right? And so if you want to be elected at the municipal level, where responsibility for approval of these things is planted within, then you have to make promises to people and you have to show results to people who vote. And the people who vote, these are the things that they want to see, and these are the things that they vote upon. And so if people want change, and yes, this is both a curse and a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. If people are feeling frustrated about these things, it doesn't take a huge mass of you to show up and become a voting bloc that politicians at the municipal level have to respond to, right? Just enough of you have to come together and organize to do this. But the problem is people, they look to the federal government to solve local issues, which I find very bizarre, but that's kind of where it's at. And then they look at the provincial level, and then they look at the municipal level last to solve local issues, right? So
We have
that's
a
kind of where we're at.
You said we have a broken municipal democracy. Fascinating. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes. And we're going to talk more about zoning, planning, development, and a broken municipal democracy. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Alex Beheshti. We're talking about municipal zoning and housing and development and issues. Alex Beheshti is a senior consultant at the Altus Group Economic Consulting, where he provides services related to urban planning and land economics. And he's also one of the lead authors of a study both in 2020 and 2022, municipal benchmarking studies, which looked at development application timelines in the GTA in Canada. Do you think the timelines, Alex, are bad?
Yeah. In so many words, yes, they are bad. They create a lot of problems in that it makes it very hard for the market to respond to prices. And so in economics, we have a thing called price elasticity that measures this. This is an actual measurement you can do in economics. And the CMHC did a very big fancy study and they looked at it. And the very places that have terrible timelines also have terrible price elasticity. And so, if demand shows up at your door, the ability to, turn up the system and build the housing it takes a long time. There's long lead times. And so prices go up and up and up and up, and then it takes a while, and then finally we get this like glut of housing, and then it goes down and down and down. And so, if you want to look at it, there's a lot of ways you can say, is this a problem? My biggest problem with it is it creates a lot of volatility And so, you know, what you see is in places with low price elasticity is you see these huge like you see the highs are high and the lows are low. So you see these huge price spikes and drops, and you never really want to see that, especially with something as so critical to the economy as real estate, because on those downward, on the downward, a lot of risks start popping up to your financial system, your wider economy, and so forth. So this is a big problem, and it's a problem that's kind of metastasized in various aspects of our society.
How is it, that's a pretty powerful word, metastasized in other aspects of our society?
Yeah, I mean, so like, for development application timelines, so we're talking a lot about like the experience of developers and people trying to build lots of housing. But, also timelines are an issue for people trying to just do basic renovations of their homes, right? Like you want to build a deck, the bylaw doesn't allow you to do that. So therefore you have to apply for what's called a minor variance. And a lot of people, they will interact with the planning system through minor applications, and the experience they end up having leaves a really bitter taste in their mouth, right? Like they go like, "Holy moly, that was a terrible experience. I was treated like a criminal," or like, like what I was trying to do was very accusatory, but I look at my neighborhood and the other 50 homes on the street have a a porch or whatever. Like why am I being treated like this? The timelines were impossible. The things I was being asked for were ridiculous, so on and so forth. And then, the metastasization from that is like, look, I believe as a person that government should try to solve big problems. But if people's experience of government on the small stuff is so bitter, they lose the belief that governments can solve for the big stuff, and that becomes a problem, right? And so, I really say to my colleagues in planning, like, when people interact, you got to make sure that they have confidence coming out of it. It's kind of like the passport office. If you don't feel like you can get your passport on time, how can you believe that the government can do anything else right?
I think it's a really good point. So what do we do? How do we solve this?
First of all, like I said, like, we talked about a little bit earlier, like, the municipal democracy is kind of broken. When you have 20 or 30% people coming out, that's a problem. That's not a system that is generating a lot of legitimacy. Look, people who are elected based on the votes. Like they are the duly elected councilors and mayor and so forth. However, it's very hard to act in the interest of everyone when only such a small, narrow number of people have come out and voted. So that's one of the big solutions. The other solution is to just kind of like push for zoning reform. Like if at an individual level or a less complex level, if 50 people on your street have porches, why don't you just legalize porches? Why do you make everybody do an application for this? As I said before, the fastest application you can do is the one you never have to submit. And I think as planners, we should go back and look at all these rules that we've set and ask ourselves, are they necessary? And really start to try to cut down on the unnecessary rules and regulations. At a minimum for people just trying to renovate their homes, at the maximum for the homes that we're trying to build to actually so we can house everybody in our society.
So if some mayor hired you as the head of planning and said, "I want you to get rid of rules," what would you do?
First, I would take a look at like how many rules do we have in place, and there's different ways you can measure that. So, in the city of Toronto, for example, we don't have one zoning bylaw in place. We have multiple. A lot of the former amalgamated cities that make up the amalgamated city of Toronto now, like the city of Etobicoke, Scarborough, and so forth, their zoning bylaws are still in effect, which is kind of ridiculous. We're how many years ago since we were amalgamated, and if I was a chief planner, I'd be like, okay, we've got to create one harmonized bylaw that applies to the whole city. So that's one way we can start cutting down on the rules, is to make sure that we have one bylaw. The other one is I would start looking at like how flexible is our zoning? How many people are constantly coming in and asking for either rezonings or variances to the zoning? And I would say like, okay, what are some of the common things that people are asking for that we can eliminate? If people are constantly coming in to ask for, let's say, half a meter of height because they want to install insulation to make their houses, more efficient, then let's just put that in there. Let's just get rid of it. Let's cut down on the unnecessary stuff. The problem is, as a planner, is I can put forward lots and lots of ways we can cut down on the zoning bylaw, the rules and regulations that are hindering people from doing the things that they need to do. But at the end of the day, as a planner, I don't approve zoning bylaws. It's city councils that do. And so there's no chief planner that can solve anything if there isn't the mayor and council on board for that.
What other mistakes are we making with zoning?
The biggest mistake I think we make with zoning is that we try to get it to solve issues that it cannot solve, right? So, one of the biggest problems in our society is there's low levels of social trust between people. And you can see this through the zoning because we do indeed zone for people. Like let's take an example of a university town that wants to build some purpose-built student housing. The neighbors get very upset. They go, we don't want to live with students. We already live with students in our neighborhood and we don't like them because they cause problems. They like to party late at night or whatever. And so what happens is the students don't disappear. They stay in your neighborhood, but they don't live in housing that is appropriate. And so, like because the folks there, they don't want to approve housing, they don't want to allow housing to be approved for students because the students make noise or whatever, and they don't feel that anyone at the city can help them through bylaw officers or whatever to deal with this friction they're having with their neighbors. And so their solution that they look for through the zoning is to get the zoning to prevent them from having those neighbors in the first place, which by the way never works because people end up where they end up, right? But the zoning bylaw cannot fix these kind of issues. We have to accept that people are all sorts of people are going to be part of our community, and that we have to find ways to live together. And the zoning bylaw is not going to fix the fact that there's no such thing as incompatible people, but there is issues of enforcement with noise and whatever that municipalities have to invest money in. And there's frankly far too few bylaw officers or whatever. And so to fix that issue, we use zoning, which is not an appropriate method.
So what do we need to do? How do we fix this? How do we fix the zoning morass that we have right now?
So part of it is investing in social trust, right? So part of it is investing in bylaw officers and so if people have noise complaints with their neighbors, they can feel confident that they can get a resolution to that rather than the resolution they seek is to prevent that neighbor from ever appearing in the first place. Like that's the first one. The next one is having politicians that are brave that will say like, look, our zoning bylaws can sometimes are relics of the 50s, like the buildings that are legal to build as we call as of right, meaning you don't need any amendment or variation, do not fit the values and preferences of people today. And so like let's work on reforming this. And maybe I'm gonna do something that isn't universally popular, but I'm gonna do it because it's right. We don't have enough politicians that want to act because it's right. And I do appreciate the point of being a politician is to get elected and reelected, but at some point, we need leaders to be leaders.
Need leaders to be leaders. And what you're saying is that politicians, too often you think, aren't doing what's right, but are doing just what they need to do to get elected.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one reflection of this is so, there's something called the Ontario Land Tribunal. Some people would call it the Ontario Municipal Board. This is where people who have disputes with a municipality over decisions they've made on land use planning can go to have their disputes adjudicated in a kind of semi-judicial setting. Now, the argument from some quarters about why this is a bad thing is they argue that politicians make poor decisions because they know they can just be bailed out by the OLT or OMB or whatever you want to call it. Name changes every week. My question is, why is that true? Why can't a person make the correct decision, the decision they know that is the right decision from the get-go? Why would they rely as a crutch, right? Like that's more of a character flaw of the individuals we're electing rather than a structural issue. I don't think people are making poor decisions because they know they can get bailed out. I think if you eliminated the OLT, you're not going to see a lot of decision making actually change. But it's always interesting to me when politicians don't want to have anybody to have oversight over them, and that always makes me feel suspect. The other thing too is, a lot of politicians think that because I've been elected, I don't have to follow the rules. So you'll see people, I don't care what the Planning Act says. I don't care what the growth plan says. I don't care what the law says. I was elected, and therefore, because I was elected, I have a democratic right to so that the laws and rules don't apply to my decision making. And that's never correct. And that's again another symptom of the kind of poor leadership that we have at the municipal level. When people say that and nobody blinks, nobody spends a minute being like, wait a minute, rules should apply to your decision making. If we have rules about how you're supposed to make a decision, whether or not that outcome of that decision is something I like or not, you're supposed to follow the rules, and we should be holding our leaders to following the rules. And this excuse making you see around why leaders don't make decisions based on the rules is something I think should be a cause of concern, and I think is a reflection of that kind of weakness of leadership that we have.
I interviewed Joe Barrich, Urban Strategies, and he told me that the OMB, the OLT, allows politicians to not be addled because they don't have to make what they know is the right decision because someone else above them will make the right decision. You don't agree with that?
I think what was stopping them in the first place? Like, you know what I mean? Like just because there is this outlet or valve that exists doesn't mean you should excuse the initial wrong decision. And the fact that people are self-reflective enough to know that they're probably doing the wrong thing, but yet they still do the wrong thing, makes me concerned. And the other thing too is like I look at other jurisdictions. So I look at British Columbia. You can still appeal municipal decision making, but it doesn't go to a semi-judicial uh, setting. It goes to the courts, and then therefore what you can appeal about is a little bit more narrow. But I look at the decision making in British Columbia and what the municipalities there do, and I don't really see very much variation from what you see politicians in Ontario, municipal politicians in Ontario do. So where we don't see this appeal system, I don't really see an improvement in decision making. So I don't really like, I really don't think that, it's the excuse. It's just an excuse that people do rather than face up to what they're doing is wrong, and we should actually maybe hold politicians to it and count that they're making bad decisions in the first place. Like at some point, the accountability has to rest at the person making that bad choice.
Alex, this is a fascinating conversation. Really quite interesting. I appreciate you making some of these issues more obvious and aware to us all. We're going to have to take a break and come back with some comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Back with Alex in two. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm chatting with Alex oh my gosh, Beheshti.
Beheshti. There you go.
Beheshti. He's with Altus. He's an urban planner. He's a smart guy, as we've found, and he's also willing to not hold back and tell us the truth. So I got to ask you, Alex, given all these complaints that you've had about zoning, is it bad? Should we just get rid of it all? Does it actually do any good?
That's a great question. So, we can actually look to England. So in the United Kingdom, they don't have zoning. And so what happens there is you have to constantly apply. You do know what your land is for. There is land use designation. So you do know something is residential or commercial or so forth. But there's no property rights. There's no specific property rights. And so I don't agree. There are some people who think zoning reform means getting rid of zoning. I think that's naive at best, foolish at worst. Well, like zoning is important. It's not just a control mechanism. It is something that tells people what their property rights are, what the development potential of the land that they own is. And I think what we need to do when you have zoning that's really inflexible, it becomes what we call discretionary. So it becomes like in the United Kingdom, where you have to constantly ask the city for every little thing that you want to do with your property. And so the solution is to make zoning more flexible, more open, more contemplative of the things that people want to accomplish with their land that they use, and that would be instead of taking away property rights, would be enhancing property rights. And I really think property rights is really important to uphold in all of this. And one just thing I want to say about property rights, it boggles my mind how many municipalities out there that there are and how much land there is where you don't have easy access to the zoning bylaw, which I think is crazy. If there was one solution I could ask the province is to say that if the zoning bylaw has to be on the internet that people can access. Like ignorance of the law is not an excuse, but nor should governments be excused from making laws available to people in modern standards, which is I think maybe where I'll leave it off.
You made a very provocative comment about 20 minutes ago. You said that we have a broken municipal democracy. Do you really think that?
When I look at turnout and I see that, there's, in some places it's 10%, other places it's 20%, like it really, really concerns me. Like, who is showing up when only 10 or 20% of eligible voters are showing up? That's an incredibly narrow band, and it becomes very hard, like the point of electing someone is that technically we're all supposed to be voting on who we think can lead the best and work in the interests of society. I mean, in reality, we all vote for the person who's best for us. But it becomes very hard for politicians to act in the interests of all people in society at one degree or another when we elect them from such a narrow band of actual the pool of voters. And so that really deeply concerns me. I think until that issue is kind of addressed, it's insanity to kind of expect to keep doing the same thing over and over again. So electing people with 10 or 20% of the voter pool and expecting to get different results. Like, I don't really think we're going to get very many different results until that issue is either resolved or the province says, okay, we're going to start to take back a little bit of how we do land use planning, and we're going to be a little bit more dictative in how land use planning should
Well,
occur.
they're
And
effectively doing that with ministerial zoning orders and as of right and what is it, major street transit station areas, et cetera. They're effectively doing that. They're taking over more and more.
in very, very, very specific instances, yes, they are. Except in the new bill that's coming up, they're kind of making a full retreat back, which is a whole, I think we could do a whole show on Bill 185
Well, we
itself.
should do it again. Alex, we're going to have you back on Bill 185. I really appreciate it. That's been a really fascinating conversation today. And I think you've given us some really interesting insights into what we need to do with zoning, making it more flexible, making it more open, making enhancing property rights. I think that this broken municipal democracy that you've talked about, and bottom line, that we've got such an incredibly long review and approval process, 5 to 10 years versus the 2 to 3 years it takes to construct. And I think that, your issue about social trust, broken social trust, is also a really interesting issue. Alex, really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Ryan.
We're going to take a break and come back in just a couple of minutes with my own thoughts on this issue. Stay with us, everybody.